Good evening, everyone. My name is Vasily Chumakov, and on behalf of the Student Lecture Series Committee, we're very excited to have you join us tonight for the opening lecture of the 2024-2025 Diane Lewis Student Lecture Series. This year's lecture series, endowed by Elise Jafe and Jeffrey Brown, focuses on storytelling within the practices of art and architecture. Storytelling is a force which is capable of constructing and deconstructing the narratives of our lives, communities, and surroundings. Architecture is not frozen concept within the space it has engineered, but a transmutable narrative, a story that is embedded within the landscape it occupies, the community it serves, and the ever-changing reality it reflects. For tonight's talk, we are joined by Professor Charles Waldheim. He is the John E. Irving Professor at Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where he directs the school's Office for Urbanization. He's also the recipient of the Rome Prize Fellowship from the American Academy in Rome, the Visiting Scholar Research Fellowship at the Canadian Center for Architecture, the Sanders Fellowship at the University of Michigan, and the Cullinan Chair at Rice University. Besides these many accolades, Professor Waldheim is the author, editor, and co-editor of numerous publications on the relationships between landscape, ecology, and contemporary urbanism, such as Landscape as Urbanism, A General Theory, and The Landscape Urbanism Reader. He developed the theory of landscape urbanism in response to the industrial economies and emergent ecologies of the American city. In addition to his research, Waldheim advises public and private clients on questions of contemporary urbanism and collaborates with multidisciplinary teams on urban projects around the world. His work has been published, exhibited, and presented internationally, and he has collaborated on urban projects with a range of leading designers, including the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, Morphosis, Grossmax, and others. Without further ado, please welcome Charles Waldheim.
Thank you. That's very kind of you, Vasily. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you for coming.
It's been my pleasure. I was in this room maybe 15 years ago when Graham Shane invited me into his class to give a talk, and I just had this kind of enormously kind of fond recollection of him coming back into the building. It's nice to see all of you. And I was happy to meet some of the first year students for whom it's still not too late to continue to say congratulations. Vasily was with his team, kind of very proudly showing off the studio, which is this amazing kind of historic space in our field, and has so many stories within it. And he was very gently kind of apologizing for the fact that we're only a few weeks in. You should see it in like November. There's going to be a lot more work, and I said, no, this is perfect because it's still early enough that we all still have our faculties, right? Everyone's still above average. It's all potential. Nobody's falling asleep yet. So it's nice to see you all here. Thanks for coming out. It's a real pleasure to see old friends and new. So Vasily, in his invitation, asked me to say a few words about landscape architecture. And so I'll start there with a couple of observations before I share with you the kind of main course. So I studied architecture and had an interest in the city from the very beginning, and had no training in landscape architecture. I happened to be in a school in Philadelphia where there was a landscape program. And as I was developing the early part of my career, it became clear that if you were working on cities, the future of the city, the American city, was going to be about landscape. And I was underprepared. I was in debt out of the wrong graduate program. Basically, I had no, literacy in landscape. And so for a number of years, I've been kind of working the seam between urbanism and landscape topics. And at some point, I find myself crossing over between the two. And a part of what I try to do is to try to find ways of communicating between the two in part. So the short version is that landscape architecture was invented on the eastern seaboard of the US, mostly in New York, at the end of the 19th century. And it was invented by a group of boosters who found that in the context of industrialization, the growth of the metropolis, the existing categories, architect, engineer, artist, gardener, were not adequate, that we needed a new profession. And this happens rarely, relatively speaking. It's not so often, on the one hand, if you're inventing or renaming your profession every time there's a new hurricane or a new virus vector or something, you're probably lost intellectually. And if you never reform your profession, you're probably at some point redundant, right? So somewhere in there, the idea of a new profession is formed. And the first commission to landscape architects in this culture, where the professional association was formed in the 1890s, was not for the design of a park. It was not for the design of a pleasure ground or a garden. It was for the planning of Manhattan north of 155th Street. So you remember the commissioner's grid went from Houston north, and it ran kind of exhausted to 155th Street, where it stopped so far north of urbanization at the point in time that it was developed that it was inconceivable to go farther. And of course, the topography of Washington Heights being what it is, it was a whole other, kind of topography. Frederick Law Olmsted, who you may have heard of, was not an architect nor a landscape architect. He was a farmer and a journalist. He found himself at loose ends, and he took a job as a civil servant working for the city and the state as the superintendent of the newly planned Central Park. Very quickly, as this kind of civil servant, he began internally to lobby for the holding of a design competition. He then entered that design competition with one of the most talented architects he could find, Calvert Vaux, and he won on this party line vote. The 5 Republican reformers voting in favor of the Republican Olmsted, the 4 Democrat machine, kind of old school board members voting for the city's engineer. So there's an interesting history there. What's important for our purposes tonight is that in that process, Olmsted referred to himself as an architect. He did so explicitly. He was very clear that the mantle, the professional identity of the architect was the central foundation of what would be the new art, as he called it. In 1859, after a couple of years of building Central Park, Olmsted was kind of running his budget to the ground. The board was kind of frustrated, and they gave him a kind of sabbatical for 6 months. They said, go away, get control of this operation. He was having a kind of nervous breakdown. And so he went on this famous tour in 1859 of European parks and gardens. Hey, we just got started. I haven't said anything even interesting yet. On this tour, he comes to spend 2 weeks in Paris in November, during which he visits the Bois de Boulogne, the French royal hunting ground, 8 times, which was in the process of being converted by Adolphe Alphand in the kind of renovation of it into a major public park. And there, Olmsted sees drawings that were stamped service still architect paysagiste. That's the hyphenated architect hyphen paysagiste. It's like architect landscapist, basically. And this was a practice that had evolved in France since the work of an engineer called Jean-Marie Morel at the beginning of the 19th century. From that time on, Olmsted returns to the US. He adopts the English language translation landscape architect, and he attaches it to the first commission, which is the planning of northern Manhattan. And so in that origin myth, what I want to say to you is, in its origin, landscape architecture was meant to be the profession responsible for the city, the whole shoot and match, everything, streets, roads, infrastructure, the entire organization of urbanization, not simply the stuff that landscape got left with. The reason I was confused as an undergraduate and why I was told by my mentors, don't talk to the landscape architects, was in the 20s and 30s, city planning emerged, town planning, city planning, and they basically took our urban contents with them. And it left landscape kind of bereft. It left us with the aesthetic project, transcendentalist philosophy, plant material, and the kind of decorative stuff that doesn't seem so interesting. And so fast forward 2 times in the last century, people have tried to recapture the urban content through landscape, first in the middle of the 20th century as landscape planning, but a number of people tried to organize planning as a kind of applied natural science to organize the modern city. And then in the early years of the 2000s, the last 2 decades, under the rubric of landscape urbanism. So in each of those moments, the disciplines that you enter into are kind of contested, and they're fighting in a way to articulate like what it is they have to offer. That's where I thought I would start, just by way of a kind of brief. And if anybody's interested in talking more about landscape, I'm more than happy to. Obviously, what I have to share with you today is landscape-based, as is most of my work. So my research group is called the Office for Urbanization, and we've published this research project that's been kind of several years in the making, and it is a collective work along with members of my team, so doctoral candidates Charlie Gaillard, Min Yao, Boya Zhang, and then former graduate students, including Mariana Gomez-Luque, Mercedes Peralta, both of whom are on to doctoral work of their own. It also included collaboration with a number of faculty at the GSD, and it's one of the roles of the office is to bring faculty together around a range of topics. We were invited several years ago to meet with friends in China, partners who were working on the process of agricultural modernization. And over the course of several years, we were advising them as partners from a point of view of kind of technical knowledge and expertise. And after that work, we then stepped back, as we often do, and made a kind of critical reflection, and then produced this research project and book under the rubric of 50 species towns. In short, it's a new paradigm or a new model for agrarian new towns. These are towns in the Chinese model of relatively modest size, 25,000 people, 50,000 people, relatively small. And it's based on this notion of heritage crops. I'll say more about that in a minute. We're interested in finding ways of cross-cultural communication. I believe one of the central, issues for our generation has been how can we go from one culture to another and share knowledge? I believe personally that modernity is an incomplete project. I understand that there are challenges with that. I understand that there are limits to the extent that we can exchange knowledge, but I very much want to be in a world and contribute to a world in which we have mobility, geographic mobility, class mobility, and universities, institutes like this, are a fundamental part of that. At the same moment, we've also been aware of the failures of modernism, many of them having to do with the hubris of us expanding and exporting in an imperial way our cultures to other people, right? So rather than us all retreating back into our valleys, like Peter Zumthor, and saying, I can only work in this place, I'm nervous about that as a cultural project because it's related to a politics in which we're all supposed to be in certain places. And I'd much rather be in a world where we can mix and move and mingle. As you may know, in 2016, Chinese state apparatus organized one of their infamous plans, a 5-year plan, which was focused on agricultural modernization. And the way that I think of this now is it was an opportunity to bring the only part of the economy that had not been modernized, the village economy, into the modern economy. So following Deng Xiaoping's openings, as kind of, state capitalism has been operating in China, the village life has really resisted that in many, many ways. In order to do this work, we began by examining what we call agrarian imaginaries. It's our sense that periods of agrarian life or periods of agricultural development in Chinese history are quite distinct, and we needed to know them in some level of detail. And the idea here is that as we enumerate these various moments, that most often these moments are characterized not only in ideologies and policies and technologies and practices, they're also represented visually. There's a kind of visual rhetoric to them, right? I mean, if I could get this shirt on Etsy, I would be able to, dine out more often. And so the idea that each of these eras of agrarian development bring with them a certain kind of rhetoric, and that we're not immune to that today, that the rhetoric, continues in the way that we're buying and selling real estate. For me, this 13th 5-year plan for economic and social development of the PRC in 2016, it begins, I think, with quite laudable goals. Like I share the interest that the Chinese have in feeding their population. I think this is a laudable goal. One of their goals is to improve the living and working conditions back on the farm. As you may know, there's this middle generation that's left and gone to the big city, many of them leaving behind grandparents and children, and there are a number of social and public health questions there. Their goal has been to introduce the modern economy in a way, or to integrate agrarian life and development into the economy across China, and to do two things that are seemingly contradictory. One is to modernize in the way that we did in the West in the 20th century, right? So large monocrop cultures for rice and corn and wheat and soy, and to do so through genetically modified seeds and a range of other highly technical processes, but simultaneously to do what we're trying to do now in the 21st century, to kind of introduce more ecological logics to their agrarian work and to reduce the use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides. They are also simultaneously interested to bring something that would be conventional in the United States or Western Europe, a kind of ecotourism, right? The idea that you would go to a place and spend time at an Airbnb or maybe go to a resort, education, culture, health, tourism, and also bring in information technology to kind of bring better information, better technical practices. And as they say in a way that in English translation sounds a little bit ominous, like promote the complete mechanization of the production process of the nature crops. That's heavy, and they face enormous challenges, right? They will necessarily need to look at water, both water scarcity, but also the availability of water and the management of stormwater. And they will also need infrastructure, a range of different infrastructures. But at its base, the goal is to improve the conditions for people living and make it more desirable for people to move back to the farm. And our advice to our friends in China in this regard has been that these are laudable goals, and we can help advise them on how to think about them. But there are great challenges. One of the challenges is that, as we did in the West, as we did in the US and Canada, there's the real danger that they erase their intangible cultural heritage in culinary form. Right? I believe the fact that we basically erased both the indigenous, Native American populations and their foodways, but also the myriad varietals and types of foodstuffs that were grown in the pre-modern era. We've erased that in favor of ethanol, corn subsidies, and a range of other practices and policies that I think are not desirable and shouldn't be repeated. And there's a real danger that the Chinese may, in fact, repeat that history, and that this monoculture cultivation has to be balanced with another point of view. Hey guys, it's never really clear to me if staying later in the crit cycle means you get a better crit or a worse crit. And so, as a critic at the desk who makes lists for crits at the desk, it's always an interesting, especially at the beginning of education. But I'm glad you guys are here. Thanks for being here. So we consulted both in China and with our friends around the world on this notion of intangible cultural heritage, right? So in a way that 20 years ago, the notion of preserving old buildings was kind of a radical new idea in China. That's now conventional, it's now normative there. The idea that preserving their intangible cultural heritage is a relatively new idea is a part of what our work is based on. And as of 2019, Chinese culture had 40 elements inscribed in UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage. These have to do with operas, musical performances, dances, local crafts, and other kinds of very specific practices. And they have both the UNESCO and also China have robust data on their most valuable heritage crops. Okay? This has been some of the most interesting part of the research for me. I get to China as often as I can. Having said that, I'm by no means an expert in Chinese foodstuffs. But the idea is that there's nothing more meaningful to us than what we put in our bodies, right? That intimate relationship between plants and ourselves. And in fact, what we feed our children, I can't imagine anything more personal. And I'm hopeful that as opposed to showing up, off plane from the West and saying that we have a new model, we might be able to engage in a conversation with people about what they eat and how that might inform the identity of where they might live. This work is informed by a number of precedent projects. I'll share with you one. The work of my friend Kongjian Yu. Kongjian Yu is a landscape architect. He has a firm called Tourandscape. He was of the generation to benefit from Deng Xiaoping's openings and to make it to Beijing Forestry University on testing into university. His older brother did not because of his generation, right? So he's just of that right generation also to go back from a degree at Harvard where he did the doctorate, go back to China to launch a new kind of Western style design firm. In this one precedent that I want to share with you, Kongjian Yu was invited in, as landscape architects often are, kind of at the end of the development of a campus for a new university in the Shenyang Architectural University campus at a moment when the planning was done. The prominent buildings by major architects were all done. There was no time, it was like 6 months and no budget. And it's like, well, can you please prepare a landscape plan? And what Kongjian Yu did was, I thought, kind of brilliant. It's indicative of his habit of mind. He identified the varietal of golden rice, Oryza sativa japonica, which had been grown in this place for hundreds and hundreds of years and was erased, urbanized to build the campus. And he said, well, the farmers that we moved are still here. We can just bring the rice back. And it's a kind of very deft cultural moves because on the one hand, it produces a modern looking university campus, right? It's like LAs and places to sit. And for, a generation or two of aspiring Chinese, it represents a certain ideal about education. It seemed to be something of the West. But at the same time, the material of it, right, the fabric of which it's made, is the cultural process that was removed to produce it. So there's a very effective cultural critique underneath. That combination is what I'm interested in here. And the rice becomes a kind of mascot, right? It becomes like the identity of the sports teams. Anybody here from Nebraska? We have Cornhuskers in Nebraska, apparently. So there are precedents here. The rice is sold in the campus bookstore. There are planting and harvest festivals. And I don't know how students here or students at my university would feel about being in the fields again. But there's a kind of deft relationship here between the identity and cultural heritage, right? So in this case, the rice becomes the kind of spiritual identity of this new institution that had very few markers to its identity. And that's sort of the germ of the idea. That's the seed of the idea. And as opposed to inviting people to move into Newtown 47B, we tried that. It was a bad idea. Nobody wants to live in Newtown 47B, whatever its charms may be. The premise here is that we will identify for each new town a very particular heritage crop that's specific to that region, that has deep cultural meaning and memory associated with it, and that we can do 50 of them. And so you might become associated and live in one of these towns. And as a thought exercise, we tried in making the project try to answer every question that you might need to answer in developing a new town plan, a new model for urbanization, right? A new pattern of infrastructure, a new form of architectural typology, a new housing structure. Try to answer every question, not from the point of view of our desires, but from the kind of non-human desire of the plant itself. This is meant to be also a critique of the ways in which we tend to think about urbanization. And it's also a critique of the ways in which the 2016 plan is rolling out in China, in which, you know, my uncle has a piece of land up by the highway and it would be good if we put it here and then we'll make more money if we do this. And so in that regard, we're trying to offer a way forward that's both distinct and critical, but also productive. The jujube, or Chinese date, Sisyphus jujuba, grows in the northern latitudes, 29 to 52 north, in a temperate semi-arid climate. Jia County, in particular, has cultivated the jujube fruit for over 3,000 years. And their ancient jujube gardens contain individual trees that are themselves 1,000 years old or more. And they also have assembled each cultivar in the history of jujube's domestication. You may know, those of you that are jujube fluent, in a way that I was not. I don't think I had ever had a jujube before I started the project. The fruit has more vitamin C than the orange, more sugar than sugarcane or beet, and yet it grows in these very arid conditions in the north and west, where more commercial varieties would not survive. You can see here in Jia County, the Jujube Festival, right? So we're interested not just in the species itself, not just in the foodstuffs, but the entire cultural organization around it, right? That these things are built upon notions of gathering. I'm not sure exactly what's going on here, but they seem to be enjoying it. It seems meaningful to them in a way that I could give back to them. And we try to pay close attention to the plant itself, but also to the cultivation patterns, right? So we're modeling like how do the fields organize themselves, what kind of geology, what kinds of soil. And in the book, we have quite a lot of detail about each one of these things. It happens also to be true that with agricultural practices, with food and their waste products, they also tend to inform material culture, right? So the coloration of these things end up soaking their way into the culture in a variety of ways that are non-trivial, I think, right? They tend to color, like literally color, texture the place. And we're also interested in this case to try to derive something of the morphology of this new town from the growth logic of the species itself, if you follow. Located on the Los Plateau, jujube gardens grow in the world's largest deposit of dust, hundreds of meters thick. These soils consist entirely of wind-borne material from the desert formed in the leeward rain shadow of the Himalayas. This soil is loose, porous, highly susceptible to erosion, but is also quite fertile. The creeping roots of the jujube tree are effective in reducing soil erosion, especially when planted in rows that form windbreaks. And accordingly, the jujube is prevalent in regional culture. Traditionally, the jujube god apparently is worshipped on the 1st and 15th days of the first lunar month. And these foods are prepared on holidays, on a variety of moments. Ultimately, urbanization and the growth of cities poses the greatest threat to the jujube cultivation. And in Jia County, the government is formulating development and planning procedures to try to resist this, right? The traditional model of date cultivation in Jia County is characterized with interplanting of jujube and grain, millet or soybeans in particular. So these are not monocultures, they're interplanted with other species. And ultimately, a series of surrounding fields that provide other forms of sustenance. These orchards also incorporate poultry farming at a small scale, which helps to reduce pests and to fertilize the trees in a kind of closed loop agricultural process. In Jia County, the cultivation of this fruit produces something like 80% of the local income. In each of these regions that we've developed a new town, we've also spent time looking into the forms of architectural and urban block structure. In this case, in this region, the skinny courtyard is the major residence associated with agriculture. And since ancient times, the limited agricultural land and large population has been prominent, which leads to a dense kind of packing of this particular type of skinny courtyard. So what you're seeing here is we looked into the research about building types and agrarian form in China. And we then scanned thousands of found examples on satellite photographs to do a kind of X-ray on the left of the range of what a skinny courtyard, like how fat can a skinny courtyard be. And then from that, we try to derive a new typology that can address, contemporary models of development, contemporary models of density from, let's say middle-rise buildings in the 20 or 30 stories all the way down to sort of individual villas at the scale of the individual family house. And so in that work, on a kind of tabletop or on a kind of petri dish, we're also trying to derive a kind of infrastructure pattern, a kind of land use pattern in an abstract way from an understanding of the plant's growth. We then grow those two things into each other, so we get a kind of a baseline kind of urban structure from the densest at the bottom to the least dense at the periphery. And then we test drive that on a site in which each of the choices, south-facing slope, kinds of soils, what kind of water is determined based on the prevalence of the jujube plants. And in this regard, again, without making greater claims about that, we're interested in trying to find a way to be local and specific and of a place in a deep and meaningful way, but also to be doing something to contribute to processes of modernization. And for me, that reconciliation of modernization process with the loss of cultural heritage, that's one of the central dilemmas for us today. And I think there are ways, I'm optimistic that we can navigate those choices without eating the sins of our grandparents. I don't know, the first slide I saw in architecture school was the sins of my grandparents. German guys, white lab coats, we have all the answers, bring in the trucks. We know that that's not the way forward. At the same time, I think we face real challenges in the world, and they're not always going to be solved by a community conversation. The book is structured around these 50 towns, and I won't show you 50, I'll show you 2 more. And in between those, we have a range of other kind of research pieces that sort of explain our methodology. We did quite detailed research looking at the morphology or structure of agrarian towns in China in an empirical way. In the literature, it's quite clear that in the north of China, there's a kind of clustered model that is both a thermal response and a cultural response. In the middle of China, there is a kind of linear tendency along routes that are roadways and riverways. And then in the south, where it's hot and humid, there's a much more spotted distribution. This is both in the literature and empirically observed. And we did quite a lot of detailed analysis of thousands and thousands of these villages. And here we're basically sharing our own kind of working methodology, which is to try to derive block structure and proportion from thermal response. I believe that the Köppen-Geiger climate zone and latitude can be 2 primary deriving elements of urban form. And here we're showing how we develop those forms with respect to the differences of site in the range of different species. And then we cut into the book with a series of photographic essays. I've often done this in my work almost subconsciously. I'm now aware of it from my earliest work. Oftentimes, proposals for urban futures can be very abstract. They can be very dry. People will say, but Waldheim, there are no people in your drawings. And so what I try to do is say, well, what are the conditions on the ground? And how might we think about those conditions on the ground? And so this is a photo portfolio by Zhao Zhu, born in China, now based in the Netherlands where they went to school. And there's something about these photographs which are really about agricultural life. This is about life back in the villages. And they cut through and they give us a kind of realism in a way. And while the book doesn't really reconcile that realism with the kind of aspiration of the new towns, I think it's important to acknowledge the lived experience and the lives of people. And for me, these things are best captured in photography or film or documentary. Rape seeds Brassica napus are grown in the central latitudes, 25 to 50 north, and the continental winter dry climate zone. Rapeseed in China is primarily used in the production of canola oil, which is a trademark name for a form of rapeseed oil that meets certain minimum nutritional standards. Rapeseed also is used to remediate heavy metal pollution. It can be used in a plant-based fertilizer, and it can be used to reduce carcinogens in food. At most stages of its process, it's used to produce something like half of all vegetable oil in China. And you can see here, it too brings its own kind of cultural forms. In the low-lying flood-prone landscapes of Tsinghua, rapeseed is cultivated as part of this complex agroecological system developed over thousands of years on this kind of raised bed agriculture. In the water, the scooping up of fish and fish waste produce fertilizer on top of the raised bed, and these things produce a cycle of soil nutrients that's closed and much better than the Western tendency to separate those things out. On the islands of Zhoutian, rapeseed grows alongside wheat, bean, millet, sorghum, yam, leeks, and a range of other vegetable crops, again, with a system that requires no fertilizer, as it's supported by shrimp and crabs and clams and fish and a range of other aquatic creatures. The material and color conditions are interesting to us, as are the forms that the plant material takes. And as always, we're interested to try to derive difference, right? How do we find difference? I think that's among the central challenges in processes of modernization or new towns in general, is that they tend towards sameness, right? And so any opportunity we can find to locate difference within this body of material, that's been our goal. Today, the primary value of planting rapeseed in Tsinghua Zhoutian system is not agriculture, but rather from the yellow blooms that in the late spring produce this incredible touristic season with over 1 million tourists per year. So the idea of ecotourism being in the mix and the desirability of living in these places or visiting them at least for a period of time. The Huizhu dwelling is a distinctive type of residence found here, mostly by mountains and rivers. These villages are quite specific in their architectural type, and again, we've done a thorough study of them and derived a unique typology and a unique kind of urban morphology from them. And again, without making greater claims for them, the idea of a distinct rapeseed town, distinct from all the other 49 towns in which we might live in certain ways. I should note here that, of course, there's nothing that precludes people in rapeseed town from eating jujube. This is something obviously that we can talk about. But ultimately, the goal of identifying something which is modernizing, which is developing along the lines of the 2016 plan. It's producing more calories, but it's producing more meaning for the people that live in these places in a way that they might see themselves reflected in these places and come to think of them as theirs. In addition to the kind of morphology studies, we've done this work looking in the literature, both in Chinese libraries and in libraries at Harvard, the 18 building types of Chinese agricultural village types are quite well documented. Most often, the 18 have been described as they are here on the right, with a kind of ideal plan, right? If you know this idea about typology, it's a little bit like the Vitruvian Man. It's like kind of one perfect body, and you don't find perfect bodies so interesting. I think actual bodies are much more interesting, and the range of those bodies, right? Much more like a kind of public health survey or demographics is what's interesting to me. And in fact, we find that each of these types, even though they're well described, exhibit extraordinary diversity in the field, as it were. You can see on the right a diagram of size and orientation relative to sun, north-south, right? A range of sizes and thicknesses, which is much more diverse. It's much more like a species in this regard, rather than one single ideal plan. And we've done that, again, across the 18. Toul and Bruno Morende met in Paris. One was born in the steppes, the other by the sea. They came together in art school and have been practicing together ever since. These are all Sichuan province, Chengdu, the old tea house. And I mention this here in part because while some of these things can become quite touristic and maybe cliche, there is this growing awareness in China of the desirability or the value of making value-added products. Again, a kind of relatively old idea in the West and Champagne or Napa Valley, or you go to a certain, I like bourbon. I don't know if you got, you have to be in a certain county in Kentucky, right? The idea of provenance, right? The idea that if you're going to make this product, it has to come from this place. The protection of that is a well rehearsed Western ideal, and yet is a new idea in parts of East Asia, a new idea in parts of China. And at the same time, the idea of keeping these resources here, branding them nationally, continuing to build tourism around them, both the artisanal crafts, the practices, but also the cultural landscapes that many of these practices are associated with. So in that regard, the things that we've done to consolidate terroir and similar concepts in the West are still relatively new concepts in China. The Tianjin pepper, Capsicum annum, grows in the southern latitudes, 23 to 34 north, in the subtropical humid parts of China. The Tianjin pepper was actually not native to China. It was native to Bolivia, Paraguay, other parts of South America, until it was introduced in China in the 14th and 15th century. They tend to grow in areas of a certain kind of shale soil. They also are harvested by hand, and they have been cultivated for centuries now, and in so doing have this extraordinary array of sweetness and heat. For those of you that study hot things, the range of expression is quite extraordinary. When first introduced in China, they were initially used for medicine or as ornamental plants, not for food. But over the past centuries, they've become integrated into foodstuffs, as you know, if you know Szechuan cuisine. And annual festivals, competitions continue to support the cultural significance, and farmers continue to experiment with them. Again, an interest in the cultivation patterns, the ways of life in these places, the coloration, the material culture, and the particular kind of cellular structure of the way that this plant reproduces itself. The local pepper variety cultivated in Taoling Town, Xinjiang County, Hunan Province, is known for a unique three-flavor profile and has won a handful of national awards. In 2015, the Taoling pepper was declared a National Geographical Indication protected product. It's an example of what I'm referring to. It's like, now we can name this thing, it comes from this one place, and that's a production of meaning that was inherent in Chinese culture, but hadn't really been acknowledged and connected to economy more broadly. Scoville heat units, you may be aware of, are the measure of the amount of capsaicin present in the different varietals of peppers. And capsaicin is the molecule responsible for that feeling of pungency or heat or pepper that you feel. And the registration of Tianjin pepper between 50 and 75,000 units is quite significant. Despite the enormous morphological variability within this species, there are a number of recurring botanical themes: angular stems, irregularly branched, alternate, some leaves, some with cup shapes, husks that have seeds, and a series of flowers. Overall, the plants are relatively modest in height, but ultimately produce these incredible fields, kind of lush, kind of orange-red. In this region, central South China, the Hunan Big House is quite normative, and it takes advantage of relatively flat terrain and a series of thermodynamic relationships branching out along this fishbone. And so in this case, both the plant and the big house type have this kind of spine structure, these linear patterns with these kind of pods or spaces, this kind of grid-like blocks, bifurcated structures that build that. And again, applying to that some sense of density, some notion of modern construction, some notion of unique, specific density and formation, developing a new idea of how it might live in this place. What I want to close with is, again, not great claims on behalf of this as the solution to all things, but rather a kind of argument for the importance of continuing or persisting with the project of modernity on the one hand. I don't want to see us return to a place where we can't go to other countries for university, or we can't mingle ideas and meet each other and form partnerships and marriages and become enemies. And, like all of those things that are associated with cosmopolitan life for me are deeply, deeply important, but to acknowledge that they come at a cost. Right? The erasure of local identity, the erasure of local culture is among the costs of that form of modernity, too often. And in that regard, I think that there are ways, looking again at Kang Jianyi's work, that we can try to reconcile or deal with that contradiction, that dialectic between modernity and cultural heritage. And then finally, for me, the notion that in architecture, you are all being exposed at one of the great schools in the world to the practice of architecture as a historically literate cultural practice, right? You understand that, even those of you that have only been here for a couple of weeks. As we move to urban material and urban scale, oftentimes there has been a tendency to leave the urban to the adults. Like, let's leave the urban to the technocrats. Keller Easterling has said something like this, the architectural theorist at Yale. Keller Easterling has said that basically when we deal with the urban, we tend to default to other languages, like, well, the World Bank has it, or the engineers know, or, and somehow architects withdraw historically from, and for me, it's really quite important that we maintain the urban as a space for speculation, the idea of operating as a cultural projection, as a form of critique, as a kind of alternative or better future for people, and that we remain kind of engaged in the kind of fight for the future of the city. Thanks for being here. Forward to chatting.
Thank you, Charles. That was amazing. I'd like to start off the Q&A with a question of my own. What would you say are the risks associated with this monoculture-oriented production system? In the case of something like a famine, what would be the insurance policy that goes into preventing a collapse of this?
Sure, yeah. It's one of the things that I probably can do a better job of trying to articulate that. If you take the example of the Rice campus, for example, that the vast majority of the caloric and nutritional needs of the students and the faculty are not being supported by that campus quad, right? And so therefore, if there's a pest or if there's some other calamity, it's unlikely that it would affect people's ability to eat, And so what I'm trying to deal with is, on the one hand, we have the national scale plans for large scale monocrops that will need to necessarily grow up in scale. A lot of what Chinese people eat is being imported today. That's going to continue. But really, these things are more like a kind of belief system. You know what I mean? And belief systems, like money is a kind of belief system. They are also vulnerable. So it's possible that, there could be a fight over who gets Millet Town, or maybe there are two competing berry towns or whatever. That's interesting, but at the same time, the idea that these are relatively modest in scale and they benefit from the agricultural production that's going on around it, in which there are other species included, obviously. And it's not as though people in Jujube Town are obliged to just eat jujube. I mean, you can also say, I don't really like jujube. In fact, it's a little bit sweet. So in that sense, it's more of a kind of icon or a kind of mascot. But of course, if you hinge your identity around anything, any belief system, there's always that risk that maybe we think differently about the pepper now. Maybe we don't want to live in Peppertown. Maybe it goes out of fashion.
Thank you. And I'll open it up to the audience for questions.
Thank you for coming and giving such a great lecture. I was really touched when you used the Shenyang West campus, the university campus, as a beginning of an inspiration when you say, like, they identified that the riots was kind of like a waste during the construction of urbanization, but then the people are still there. I think that's it's a really wonderful idea. Like, what are like the cultural heritage sometimes is still in people's mind, even though like in the process of something got erased. But there's also, I think, there's like a concern in my mind for a long time regarding to Chinese villages or countryside is the loss of population, because like, people keep going to towns for the job condition. So in that sense, there are also many projects in China done by architects that are trying to revive certain village or to there's a lot of practices, architectural practice that starts emerging in rural countryside of China, but they don't necessarily align with like the agricultural heritage, more for tourist attraction. They're more like designing Airbnb in the town, something like a commercial zone to attract tourists. So my question would be, what do you think is architect's role in this process? And is there any way that architects or landscape architects or architects can do to better combine this idea of keeping the cultural heritage of food? Food is such an important potential. When they got the soul food movement, first question that people ask on the internet, but the most popular question they ask on the internet is like, can we plant potatoes on? So it's such an important culture for the Chinese people. But then I guess I'm just confused in like how can architects, what are the ways to that?
Sure. Yeah, it's I appreciate that reading. You've seen The Martian, right? I know you guys went to the backside of the moon. It's a little bit special. But I didn't know the story about wanting to know if you can grow potatoes on the moon. So I think there are many challenges associated with village life still, as I mentioned. I think, the mobility, the internal mobility of people to migrate within China, of course, has been well documented and has its challenges. But as I've said, it produces a series of pathologies back on the farm where, people are living in less than standard public health. As the aging grandparents don't have good public health, education challenges, there's a range of issues. And I don't think architects can address all of those things. But I find that when I do work in China, whenever I meet a mayor or somebody who's in a position of responsibility, they tend to be better educated than the people who are mayors in this country. No disrespect to my country, but it's like that's just empirically observed. And when I meet with people, I find that they are at least addressing, they have a plan. I don't know if it's going to work or not, but at least they are aware we have these challenges, right? So let's start there. We're in a culture here in the US where we can't even agree on what the issues are. We can't even agree on what the truth is, right? From that, I think there's a limit to what architects can do, and it has often to do with limits of how people think about program. Often the architect only comes on board after the program is already decided. Somebody decides, a politician, a planner, or a community decides that we need an art museum, or and what I find often is not just in China but around the world in my work, that there is a general kind of poverty of ideas about, well, one more coffee shop, one more art museum, and there's a tendency to reproduce the same things because of a kind of lack of imagination. And what I find in Kang Jianyu's work so inspirational, and why I've taken it on for my own work, is the idea of something which is a local particular food crop, I think is maybe going to be more resonant with people because we all eat. And even if you hate the jujube, as I've met some people that really don't like it, which is interesting to me, at least you have a position relative. And it's not like, well, I don't want to go to the art museum or I don't want to have an aquarium or whatever, So in that regard, I think I am always advocating for architects to be, ecologically more literate and not just about their buildings, but to think more systemically about ecology. And in this particular instance, the argument would be, if the program is already about modernization and food, let's try to do that in an informed way, in a kind of deep and serious way.
Andrew, I'm just wondering, like you're emphasizing this, I guess sort of the inevitability or requirement for modernization, and what you're proposing is a sort of opportunity to like interfere in the parts where it failed before. But I'm just also wondering, more than sort of the sprouting of plant life, where in your proposal do you see like this gap for sort of cultural life and social tradition to like build something rather than imposing all this program like it happens? So where like architecturally, where is that gap?
Yeah, it's really well put. Thank you for that. I think it gets really at the heart of the question for me. And I think it's always good to have a kind of, humility, to frame it as a question. I think it's really like a generous way of thinking about it. And not that I've got it all sorted, but I can, I'm not here to give you my politics, but I can give you the way that I approach these things, right? So there are, I think, very persuasive and very convincing arguments that say that we should not urbanize anymore. Let's start there. So a colleague of mine at the GSD who's gone back to ETH Zurich, Charlotte Maltbel-Barth, has recently called for a moratorium on new construction, for example. That's just one point of view, but one can make a very strong, I think, ethical and even moral argument that, we've got plenty of buildings. In fact, if global population is going to peak around 2070 and then go down, maybe we've urbanized enough. Maybe we should be working here in Manhattan, and maybe, enough. And I think you didn't exactly say that, but I could add that to what you're saying. The second was like, well, where is the place for things to occur spontaneously? And that's an equally valid and important consideration. In this particular, Taoist tradition and the political economy in China, I don't mean just this post-1949, regime. I mean, in general, the story I tell is I started going to juries in East Asia and in China, and I never understood we'd be at a table with 18 people ordering lunch, and they would start with the junior person, and the junior person would order something, and they'd go around the table, and they would all order the same thing that the Jefe ordered last. And it took me 2 visits to realize the junior guy knows what the Jefe wants, right? So this is also a culture where everyone has healthcare. We have people homeless right here, right? So like in that sense, I try to approach this from the point of view of a kind of unconditional positive regard that this culture has lived for thousands of years. They are organized in a very different way, and they are also much more comfortable with top-down decision-making. Now, that doesn't excuse them of their human rights abuses or environmental problems or political problems. But to your point, a part of what's at stake here is, as an architect, as an urbanist, like what projects do you take on? I think that's fundamental for all of you in your own kind of consideration ethically. And to simply say that, well, they're going to urbanize, somebody's going to have to do it. I can do an incrementally slightly better job, but I don't think that's enough. I mean, I'll leave you to your own choices. Obviously, I don't begrudge anybody making a living either. Having said that, in these processes of urbanization, particularly in China, particularly with people that I have spent time with, I know, and I understand a little bit about, what I would say is that if we can offer an alternative, I think there's a great value in that. So there's very little danger of me, an academic from Cambridge, Massachusetts, going there and forcing them into anything. I don't have a relatively powerful position in that regard. I do have good letterhead. I have a lot of research. I have an army of people working with me, and I can go and I can give them another way of understanding the problem. And if like maintaining and preserving historic buildings or like branding bespoke regional value-added culinary, those are the kinds of ideas that can catch on. And so in that sense, I think my value is really at the level of ideas. And at the same moment, there is enormous, the last thing I'll say is there is enormous friction in the world. I have very few concerns with you all coming out of this school or others with too much momentum, because there's such entropy in the world. There's so many reasons why it will stay the way that it is now and be resisted, in fact. And I don't mean to be arrogant about that, but ultimately I do think you have to make your own judgments about that project by project. And at the same moment, I do think that you can offer ideas that can improve people's conditions. Is that fair? That's a good start.
Definitely. I think and then just highlights that it's a very complex thing to consider, and I think we often look back at modernization with a lot of remorse and anger.
Yep.
But considering it in this positive way and understanding cultural differences. Yeah.
I think that's very generous of you. Thank you for that. I mean, what I can say more broadly is I associate myself with a generation of people who the first image we saw was the demolition of Pruitt Igoe as an undergraduate. Like literally that was day one. And we've internalized that level of guilt and responsibility. But I think of people like Sarah Whiting, my dean, or Hashim Sarkis, or others who are of a generation for whom it's like modernity is kind of incomplete. We need to return to it in a new way, let's say. But also because we live in our culture, at least, in a period of like kind of culturally reactionary, like basically for most of my career in the West, in the US in particular, we've decided that either it's just pure capital, right? Unrestricted, unfettered reproduction of capital, or if we do have a strong planning department, it becomes a kind of negotiation, right? And there are very few places, even in a strong Bloomberg administration here in this city, a strong director of planning could just tinker around the edges, basically. So even in that context, I find the lack of idea, the impoverishment of the discourse that we have available to us. And I think there's a role for the work that you're all doing here in producing that culture. I mean, I'm mindful of the AA files work, the AA folios out in the hallway, right? But that idea of cultural projection, the idea of our job is to imagine alternative futures is an ongoing project. And of course, we do, bear some responsibility for its impact in the world. But I would encourage you all to engage and make those ideas visible to people. Another way of thinking about that is that the alternative models we have post-Pruitt-Igoe, we can evaluate, right? It's like, I don't have a lot of faith in the kind of consultation and engagement processes that we have in this country. My favorite example was I was in Toronto on the design review board for the Waterfront Corporation, who's redeveloping the waterfront in Toronto when I lived there. And they had a mandate that said, well, we have to have community meetings. And there's a brownfield of several thousand acres and nobody lived there. So they had to bus people in to have a community meeting. And it's a form of engagement. I don't want to begrudge people that. But if you're thinking about the scale of an airport or a new highway or infrastructure, there's an argument that's emerging in this country that's called supply-side progressivism or liberalism that builds. If you follow Ezra Klein, who's a New York Times op-ed person, he's arguing that people on the left, liberals in general, do a good job at the level of rhetoric and policy, but they've stopped building things. And if you look at blue states or cities that are controlled in largely blue states, it's much more difficult to build things for a whole variety of environmental protections, community protections, et cetera. And I feel like we've overcorrected in that direction. But of course, these are important reforms, but it means that if you want to build a stable grid for solar power, it's almost impossible. It's almost impossible. And so if you look at the scale of the challenges that we face, I think that we need to look back at, well, how might it be possible to build things?
Thank you for this amazing lecture. I was wondering, with these proposed towns, is the site abstract or is there a specific site that is intended for them? Because I'm assuming that a site's position to its resources, such as water, energy, would have some sort of impact.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, as I mentioned, in the first phase of work where we were basically advising people that were actually doing stuff in the world, that was exhilarating. We did a lot of field work. And what we found was a very haphazard process that wasn't as informed even by the rational thought of where's the water, where's the highway. It was where literally do we have land with nobody that's going to fight us? And so a lot of gerrymandering and a lot of kind of disorganization, because they were primarily developing, before the economic collapse, models of housing for sale. And there wasn't really a kind of unified or synthetic idea about planning. That was our first observation. In this work, we've looked at a couple of ways to inform the siting. So one has to do with not displacing local populations, first of all. Second of all, in terms of climate, soil, solar angle, these kinds of things. And as you say, how wet is the foot of this want to be? How dry does it want to be? So all of those things went into consideration of the assembly of this land. And it's also in the context of a culture where we probably wouldn't do this way in the US. I have a thesis student this year who's doing Hemp Town in the US, which that'll be interesting to see. Because in this culture in China, there's a much more comfortable relationship to like top-down planning. And I can easily say, well, I want to draw the line at not moving populations, but if these are farm fields that are collectively owned, the state is already active in organizing them in a different way economically. And I've kind of accepted that premise as a part of our work.
Yes. Thank you for the lecture. I really appreciate the kind of talking of like the breaking away of modernism, but I can't help myself but relate it to the metabolist movement, right? Just because like even when Kenzo Tange was proposing his Tokyo Bay project, he did a lot of these like species biological derivations and try to apply those functions on the city scale.
Yeah.
And I feel like I see a bit of that. Maybe in this sense, you're not really talking about this functions of the species and bringing that on to the urban scale. Maybe it's just derivation. But maybe another bigger question is like, even preserve or empower cultural heritage at the urban scale. Because when we talk about like the absence of body, I'm thinking of the absence of body not just because it's not in the drawing, but because of the fact that the rituals of cooking, farming, that happens through the body. So those are all aspects of cultural heritage, but it's something that's so much more granular than the city block. And can landscape tackle that granularity at that large of a scale?
Yeah, it's nice. That's nice. You can keep going. I'm enjoying this. I've been called worse than Tenge adjacent. My guy's Hilbersheim, right? And he's doing something similar in Germany in the 20s and 30s, right? With ice crystals and and in general, we could say that obviously Tenge and Hilbersheim are doing very different things, but they, as did Wright, and so they had an interest in a kind of organic, kind of work, let's say. And so I'm glad that you see that. That's clearly the reference that I'm trying to build upon, and in part to kind of redeem that. There's this argument by Christopher Alexander that says the city is not a tree, and this is it's in the footnote in the book that in fact we're saying, well, could be. Because there are many, many arguments that have debunked many postmodern arguments against this notion of the organic or the kind of growth logic, the kind of analogy, the modern analogy between growth logic and urbanization. I've read them, I understand them, and we've responded to them. But ultimately, what I'm interested in is questions like, where does that form come from? Right? Because more often than not, for the reasons you've mentioned, because there is no relationship between cooking and what my kid likes to eat and the shape of the block. The shape of the block comes from somewhere, and more often than not, it comes back from some default setting. It's like, well, we make it this big now because that's what we make, or we know that we can optimize real estate values and make it this way. So by intervening at the scale of the block and saying, well, no, I can reconfigure the block to be thermodynamically more efficient, or I can orient it to solar performance, or I can make it typologically a reference back to the type of agrarian buildings around here. All of those are all gestures to try to get at that. But the real thing is to do the organic bit at the scale of morphology, but then bring the plant in as well, right? Because the vulnerability of the organic stuff is it's just at the level of form, and I want the whole thing. Is that too much? I feel like I want to take back that last sentence. I don't want the whole thing. I think it's interesting to problematize that with something that's actually growing better.
Also, I feel there are places in China where there's a rapid urbanization, but then they're like in this awkward spot where they just will stop. It's very like you have that happen very rapidly, but then it's almost like the ghost, like they call it the ghost.
Sure.
I was wondering, how do you see this complication? Because these are talking about very rural areas. Where it's almost like you're building from the ground up. They're starting from the very beginning. But in these places where it's in like an awkward in between, where they've almost stopped like halfway, you see how this would almost encourage these people to continue or even just build more life in areas.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Thank you for that. I mean, obviously, there's a long history, not just in China, but around the world, of capital cycles collapsing, leaving ghost towns. Like Christopher Martinkowski at Penn has written a very good book about Spanish ghost towns from 15 years ago, for example. I started my career on Detroit and the abandonment of Detroit. So there is an interesting history there. I guess one thing that I would say is that, the monoculture commitment to capital at a certain scale of development renders that quite vulnerable. And as the party committed overwhelmingly to certain models of development, they obviously, grew overheated, the business cycle collapsed, et cetera. Because of the relatively modest scale of these things and the scale at which China continues to grow, I mean, obviously, the new, recommendations about birth numbers, et cetera, I think of these things as relatively small scale. 25,000 people in the Chinese context is not a huge thing. Having said that, I think your observation that they grow, from greenfield up is true. And I think a part of what's at stake there is, the extent to which do we want to invest back in these places, make them attractive for people to move back, maintain some level of health and public safety, these kinds of things. And on that score, I think it doesn't preclude people having their own spontaneous cultural formations. Other things will arrive, in part because there's always a very loose relationship between urban form and the ways in which people occupy urban space anyway. Like if you see these examples where, we've just passed a rule at my employer that says if you want to protest, there's a form and I can tell you what spaces you can protest in, right? So when you think that way, right, of course, people are going to do what they want in space, right? It's not as though the shape of the city is going to constrain them or prevent them from protesting a certain way or building a new cultural festival or doing something for tourism. Those things are going to happen organically. But at bottom, people are still making design decisions about the shape of the city. And the problem is they've often been simply built on the notion of reproducing capital as fast as possible. And my goal is just to position a kind of alternative to say, well, we could do this. It might be less efficient, it might be less profitable, maybe more sustainable. You guys are good at this. Is it always this way?
Yeah,
that's great.
Good turnout today.
Good.
Kids are like some investors, right?
Good. Oh.
There's a comment from the chat, the super chat.
Uh-oh.
And Kathy, thank you for your interesting study and publication. The question is, how would you go about this study? Agricultural, structural, and this and that. There are for such a study. Thinking how local property as agriculture.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank her. It's yeah. As I mentioned, I have a thesis candidate who's beginning to take up hemp in a site in Kentucky. So it'll be interesting to see. I guess one thing that would be quite different would be the nature of the heritage crop. Let's start there. Right. We have a history. We have a tradition in which there are certain things that are already codified. So the question would be: are we looking at, is it Bourbon or Napa Valley, or is it something new? And my interest would be on something new, probably. And then secondly, it would make sense probably in a place that's growing, right? I mean, as the world continues to urbanize, we probably could apply this kind of thinking in a place that is already growing in a way that seems less desirable or less sustainable, less healthy somehow. So if you look at the places that are urbanizing today, in America, and you identify something which is a unique, specific, kind of culinary experience in a place, I think that's all you need, really. But it would probably take a very different form. I mean, we're not building 20 and 30-story apartment blocks in the middle of nowhere like we are in China, right? That's a very specific cultural response. My guessing is it would be less dense, more diffuse, more agrarian, a little more bougie, probably.
There's another question from Amy. They're asking, how do you feel about the real experiment? What are the risks of organizing current?
So where are the edges? Where are the boundaries? What's at stake in defining the rural versus the rural versus the urban? And what are the dangers of formalizing things that are informal? The first bit first. My friends in the new urbanism talk a lot about transects. They talk about a kind of gradient that goes from density out towards something that's less dense. And I understand that as a model. I think that is not the world that I find. The world that I find is much less smooth than that. It's much more fragmented, polynucleated, lumpy, in part because the processes of urbanization are usually shaped by capital, and they're well ahead of planning processes. They can sometimes be inflected by planning property lines or jurisdictions or geologic formations. Those things can have a weak effect on them. Ultimately, in the process of land ownership and capitalization in our culture, what you find is something that's not nearly as linear or obvious. It's it's denser in the suburbs of Chicago than it is downtown anymore for weird reasons, right? So I find that when you study these things, the abstractions of rural and urban aren't too helpful after a while because they end up becoming characterized in different ways. In many parts of the world, rural studies are quite important right now, starting in the UK, parts of the US, in the West. There are many places where the urban-rural divide, meaning a population left, I think of South Asia, India, sort of China, population left back on the farm is really suffering often from a lack of infrastructure, economic opportunity, this kind of thing. In the West, often, certainly in our country, we have the opposite, where people, it's kind of brain drain, where people are fleeing, right, the agrarian life, and we have, kind of drone and robot tractors. With respect to the second bit, the formalization of the informal, the thing that's sort of not spoken about often is that ultimately somebody is always formalizing it. Like if we don't take a position about infrastructure, somebody else will. And it's not as though in the informal, that the informal has a very fixed relationship to its infrastructure. That's a part of what makes it informal. Just as I did in the analogy to protest, you don't make a space for protest and say protest here, protest happens, right? In the same way that the informal happens in parking lots or, like growing up in the South in Florida, for me, that's vernacular. That's just normal. But at the same time, somebody designed the parking lot. And the idea that those things need to be disconnected to make the informal a genuine cultural or social experience, I don't believe. But at the same time, it's not as though the design of the parking lot controls or limits future social or cultural expression, right? The life of the parking lot can become very, very interesting, even though the parking lot was designed in a certain way that's sort of part of what I'm trying to raise is the idea of just the consciousness that simply saying that we're not going to plan for it means that other people will, right? And this is basically the position that Rainer Banham takes on Los Angeles, right? When he goes to LA in the 60s and 70s, like California is a perfect idea of the American non-plan. We've disaggregated planning and responsibility to school boards, local homeowners association, state. Everybody has a little bit of power, but nobody gets to plan anything. And what that means is capital just reproduces itself in an unfettered way. And so for me, raising the consciousness that we can also be responsible for where the infrastructure goes. And simply because you make it a certain shape and you pour it in concrete doesn't preclude future social and cultural life from taking place. I feel good. I feel good about that.